Okay, I'm going to guess that everything's up and running right now. Happy March 15th, everybody. Welcome to the ChicagoLand SharePoint Users Group. This is hopefully going to be one of the more interesting ones that we've done so far. We've got a number of guest speakers. We got several different slide decks to get through. We got some cool stuff about Office 365, and we got a lot of cool stuff to talk about around the SharePoint framework. So we're going to adhere to our normal schedule, our normal agenda. Let's jump right into the slide deck. Elizabeth, can you confirm that my desktop is being shared really quick? Just let me know via Skype in another window. I just want to make sure that everybody's seeing the right one. Okay, great. Thanks, Edie. All right, let's just jump right in. Our normal stuff is going to be talking about recent news from around the SharePoint ecosystem, upcoming events, big picture stuff, then the cool new stuff, and as time permits, bring your own problem, where we share and tackle real-world problems. I see that we actually have a record crowd today. We had 20 RSVPs today. Welcome to all of the existing members that have been coming regularly, and thanks and welcome to all the new members that are joining. Even in the last 24 hours, we saw people signing up. Recent news from around the SharePoint ecosystem looks like this. February, we saw that the SharePoint framework reaches version 1.0, which begs the question, what is the SharePoint framework? Both myself and Ralph Rivas are going to be trying to explain that to the members here today. We also learned that Microsoft hints that SharePoint 2016 Feature Pack 2 is due out the second half, the latter half of 2017. You can see from the little loop over on this side. And again, this slide deck is always going to be available to members after the session, so don't be too worried if you can't see or make it out during the shared desktop. Looking ahead to March, what we've got going on in March is that Microsoft Teams, that new chatting tool, that new interactive tool, is rolling out to Office 365. I think Michael's probably going to talk more about it. I don't want to steal his thunder if he is, but it's a very cool product. We'll see a little bit about that in just a moment. Microsoft has also updated its SharePoint roadmap, and I've got links to take us to that. SharePoint list integration with Microsoft Flow is going into preview mode this month, meaning there's going to be tighter and tighter integration there, and that's something that we've been looking for, because in the first incarnation, Microsoft Flow is a little on the weak side there. Also in March, Microsoft announced improvements to the SharePoint Online news feeds. There's actually another slide on that, so I'll leave it at there. There's exciting stuff going on there. There's loads of stuff happening in Office 365 this month. I'm going to leave that to Michael Blumenthal to talk more about. And I happen to stop at a useful site. I want you guys to check this one, topsharepoint.com. Feel free to check this out. You'll see a lot of interesting news and information about the world of SharePoint on that website. Moving to the next slide, when I mentioned that Microsoft Teams is rolling out to Office 365, this is what it's starting to look like. This is where we're headed, guys. That these kinds of team sites, this team activity with this level of interaction is actually going to be what's available to us in Office 365. This is really looking cool, because I spend all day, every day, interacting with my colleagues remotely as I work from home. So this is big stuff to me, to be able to have this kind of a view, this kind of an experience. I also mentioned that there's improvement to SharePoint Online news feeds. Stuff going on in Office 365, actual stuff going on the mobile app for Android, and even on the mobile app for iOS. We're seeing that now Microsoft is embedding news right into the homepage of Office 365. Very, very cool. I believe Michael might be talking a little bit more about that. Also, Microsoft has made really good inroads on the Android SharePoint app and on the iOS app as far as integrating and leveraging and providing a very compelling user experience for news. It's going to see more and more people with Androids and Apples taking advantage and starting to use that SharePoint mobile app. Very exciting stuff. Continuing, March 2017, there's been an unusual increasing perception of Office 365 oddities lately. I've noticed it, other people have noticed it. To that end, I went out looking for other sites that I could use, other tools to monitor and understand what's going on inside SharePoint land. What I came down to is a new favorite called downdetector.com. Check out this website, guys. We don't benefit from sharing this kind of information with you. There's no plus here. There's no commission or anything. But I want to share this with you, that this is a highly active website. There are thousands of people commenting on Office 365 activity on a daily basis, but also there's a map that shows you a heat map of outages and downage. Very useful stuff that when you see hiccups and you're trying to figure out what's going on, and you're not sure if it's you, your internet connection, or if it's on the Microsoft side, this gives you a lot of information, jam-packed with information on telling you where you might, where the problem might be residing. We talked about the most recent couple of months. If we look all the way to the first half of 2017, we see that Microsoft has been promising feedback-driven updates to document lists, libraries, pages, site apps. There's going to be more web parts. There's going to be publishing sites, more Flow and Power Apps integration than ever before. There's some SharePoint add-in improvements, some modern team site extensibility, and that's also happening with the SharePoint framework. Very cool stuff. And there's going to be more performance focus on the content delivery network integration and publishing sites. If that appeals to you, there's more links that you can follow up right here. Checking the time. March, April, and May, looking ahead. We've got some events going on in March. It always ticks up March and April. We've certainly got our SharePoint user group session today, but very shortly this week, we've got Dashboard in a Day, an online event that's actually happening in Philadelphia. And what you're going to see me doing is promoting more on events.microsoft.com, because lots of these events are starting to show up online, and I want to share them with you. There's an introduction to Power BI going online, excuse me, on March 20th, a technical deep dive about hybrid cloud infrastructure. And last year was the year of the hybrid environment. That was Microsoft's buzzword. I think that's being extended into 2017. So if you have a chance to check that out and find out what it's like to be running SharePoint in both environments, what does that mean? What does that look like? How do you manage it? That March 20th technical deep dive online is actually something you might want to check out. You're going to see me starting to talk about Microsoft Dynamics, specifically in CRM. Why? Because about a third of the DNA inside Microsoft Dynamics CRM now came from SharePoint or is SharePoint. So us as SharePoint evangelists, us as SharePoint subject matter experts, members of this group, we need to be aware that we can actually add value to our organization if that organization is also using Microsoft Dynamics, the CRM. So I'm going to start mentioning at least upcoming online events that you might be able to attend. Going on in April, we've got SP TechCon conference in Austin, Texas in early April. We've got the Chicago SharePoint Users Group on April 12th. We've got SharePoint Fest DC happening on April 17th to 20th in Washington, D.C. If you want a good reason to want to get out to the East Coast, that's probably it. Then we've got May, and there's nothing else that I saw that's on the horizon. At this point, if any members are aware of other conferences, other events, SharePoint Saturdays, that kind of thing going on in the region in March, April, and May, please chat them up using the chat tool that's available to you and let us know. Please remind me, because I don't always get everything. I just try my best.
There are, Mark, this is Michael. There's a couple that I'll cover in my presentation.
Oh, okay, fantastic, Mike, thanks. The next agenda item that we always have is talking about big picture stuff. Everybody that's been a regular member the last couple of months has seen this slide talking about understanding SharePoint's purpose. SharePoint is an anchor technology, just like your ERP, just like your email, and it's important that members of this group understand that SharePoint is an anchor. It shouldn't be nice to have, it should be a must-have. It shouldn't be about trying to gain adoption. It should be about educating your leadership that they actually make decisions that they specify, they dictate that SharePoint is how SharePoint is to be used inside your organization. We want you thinking along those roads. Some other slides to ponder. Is SharePoint an anchor at your company, an actual anchor? Other anchor technologies include email, file servers, ERP systems, Microsoft Office. Here's an experiment that you can carry out with you and your other colleagues. Ask yourself the following questions. Does your leadership have to actually ask people to use email? Does your leadership have to worry about ERP adoption? Does your leadership actually permit anything except Microsoft Office, really corporate-wide? Has your leadership decked out conference rooms with all the latest equipment to make sure that you guys are collaborating as effectively as possible? If you ended up answering no to questions 1 through 3, but you did come up with a yes for question 4, then likely your leadership really does understand and value collaboration, but what they don't understand is SharePoint, at least not enough to dictate its usage, just like they do email, just like they do file servers, just like they do ERP, just like they do Microsoft Office. That means it's your job as a SharePoint SME. on the developer side, on the power user side, it doesn't matter. It's your job to actually help your leadership understand SharePoint and try to leverage us, the SharePoint evangelists in this group, to try to help you. Another way to look at it is this. These are other signs that your leadership actually gets collaboration. They understand it, but they really don't get SharePoint yet. As your leadership decked out conference rooms with all the latest equipment, in fact, have they actually installed some kind of fantabulous conference room reservation system? I saw this at a customer's just a few weeks ago. Fabulous system on the wall for reserving the different conference room and stuff because the conference rooms are so important. Does your leadership require everybody to come in early and stay late in order to be able to overlap work hours with all of your offshore teams, whether they're in Europe, whether they're in East Asia, or whether they're in South Central Asia, India, and the like? Are you being expected to overlap your work hours in order to collaborate with those teammates that are offshore? And as part of that daily collaboration, do you find yourself endlessly chatting instead of calling so that you can best understand your offshore teammates and they can understand you? If you answered yes to any of these questions, then you do have collaboration-friendly leadership, but they need your guidance. And again, the SharePoint evangelists and SME to help understand how to leverage SharePoint to improve that collaboration so that you're not staying early or coming in early and staying late, that you're not doing the overlap. You're getting your collaboration done using SharePoint. We've covered news in the area. We've covered upcoming agenda items and things that are happening on the radar, the calendar radar. We talked about our big picture stuff. The next thing that we're going to cover are 3 different topics about new and cool stuff. Let me move this particular slide deck out of the way, and I'm going to bring in a different one. We're going to start, actually it's time to segue over to Michael. Michael Blumenthal, everybody, is a member and a highly respected Microsoft MVP in the Chicagoland area. He's going to spend the next couple of minutes talking about things that are going on inside Office 365. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Mark. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Blumenthal, and I'm going to talk about some Office 365 news. Some of it overlaps a little bit with what Mark covered, but I'm going to go deeper on a few things, in particular Microsoft Teams, and provide some additional information on some upcoming events, and also I'll ask for your help as the SharePoint community in influencing how Office 365 it evolves in the near future. So with that, can everyone see my screen? You should all see a slide that says Office 365 and SharePoint News. I've got one yes, and that's good enough for me. So let me get started here then. And the news that I want to cover, there's really 4 things here. First of all, Microsoft Teams goes GA. GA is generally available. For those of you who are not familiar with the term, it means it's released to the public. You may have heard the term RTM, released to market. That was the old term they were using when they were shipping box software, and now they call it generally available. And that was announced just yesterday, and we'll talk more about that. The other thing I want to cover is talking briefly about SharePoint Framework and SharePoint Framework web parts. Again, that's more high-level news announcements. I'll leave the details of what SharePoint Framework is to Ralph. There's some events that Mark mentioned, plus 1 or 2 that he didn't, that I'm going to cover. And then finally, that product influence opportunity that I mentioned that I'll tell you about. So first off, Microsoft Teams went generally available on Pi Day, that is 3.14, etc., or yesterday, March 14th. Microsoft, at least the SharePoint and Office team under Jeff Teeper, seems to like doing things on special days such as Pi Day and Star Wars Day, May the 4th. In fact, they did this last year where on Pi Day last year, they made some announcements, and on May 4th last year, they made some announcements. So yesterday's announcements were all about Microsoft Teams. So can we do a slide, the poll slide here, and find out how many of you, if we can do the poll slide, find out how many of you are familiar with Microsoft Teams?
Sure, it's launching. It seems to be a little short, so bear with me for about 30 seconds if you want to kind of proceed through the slide, and then we'll launch it after.
Okay. So For those of you who are not familiar with Teams, and I guess we'll find out shortly how many people that is, Teams is this chat-based workspace, this new Office desktop application and mobile application that is focused on real-time chat for teams that need to communicate now. It's built by the Skype team, but it's really geared toward that immediate conversation and real-time collaboration. So it's multimedia chat, which means it's not just text chat, but of course emoticons and images and video and so forth. It also, though, the desktop application really becomes your team hub, the place you go to do your work as a team, as well as it offers a number of integration stories and it has an extensibility story, so it's of interest to Office and SharePoint developers as well. Examples of integrations that you can do with Teams is you can bring a Twitter feed into a team environment. You can have bots, virtual assistants, robots, whatever you want to call them, bots that you develop or third-party bots participate in your team and help out, whether it's through making travel reservations, scheduling meetings, or whatever else you care to build. So there's an integration story, and then, of course, Microsoft loves emphasizing how secure they are, and so they made a special point of saying that Microsoft Teams is built on the same framework and infrastructure as the rest of Office 365, which is built on top of Azure, and that is world-class data center security, as well as admin controls and so forth. So you can be very comfortable with the security story underlying this and that it all integrates together. One of the other things, here we go, let's stop for a moment before I go further, and let's take a poll and see how many of you are familiar with Teams. It says organizer must close poll to enable screen sharing. So at this point, is everyone seeing the poll?
Yes.
Okay. So let's give that a minute for people to respond, and then I guess if the organizer can share the results, I guess that's you, Elizabeth. Then we'll see what the results are, and we can take it from there. Here we go. And
fair enough.
Okay. Now I'm a presenter and I'm not seeing the results, so let's see what's going on.
Mike, did you see that? We've got about 80% know what it is but haven't used it, which is the majority of us, and about 20% that are unfamiliar with it.
Okay. Okay. So this is good to know, and that's pretty typical. I mean, we're generally early adopters here, and so and this group tends to be on the leading edge, so at least most of us know what it is. And so you've heard me describe what it is. One of the things that people have been asking a lot is, how is this different from Yammer? And I'd be curious to see what the group's opinion is, but the way that I've heard this framed and the way that makes sense to me is that Teams is for right now conversation, immediate, what they call high velocity communication, collaboration, real-time chat. Yammer is for conversations that happen over a longer time frame. So team chat happens right now. You get an alert if you're not immediately in front of it. You get a pop-up and so forth. You get a beep. Yammer chat, conversations in Yammer, discussions in Yammer, not the person-to-person, but the group conversations in Yammer, those happen, and if you don't see it right away, you may not find out about it until when you get your email summary at the end of the day or the end of the week, depending on how you've got your notifications set up. Team chat is geared toward conversations within that team. Yammer discussions are really geared toward having conversations that can span groups, span across an organization. So if you think about a suggestion box discussion of, oh, hey, I've got an idea that I think will make the company better. I'll post it to Yammer. Let's see what other people think. Or I'm a frontline help desk for some company, and today I've gotten a lot of calls about so-and-so or something or other. So I'll post that to Yammer so that the whole company can be aware of it, and different people from across the company can chime in. That's very different than Team Collab, where I'm a small team, we're working on a deliverable, and we need to be interacting immediately. Maybe we're doing a deployment, and so we're coordinating things like a Skype meeting where you've got real-time screen sharing. This is real-time instant messaging, and so it's a different time scale and it's a different focus.
So it's more like a huddle as opposed to a discussion.
Exactly. Okay. Teams is more about the huddle.
Yeah.
And then finally, the last resource there is that teams.microsoft.com is the website where you have the web-based experience, and we can go to download the desktop client for Teams. Now, I've not been in a situation where I've been doing teamwork over the last 2 months, so rather than come up with my own analysis of this, let's see, can everyone see my screen again?
We're still seeing the Microsoft Teams, Pi Day, GA, etc.
Okay. Let me see if I can. There we go. So instead of coming up with my own analysis, I just stole some slides from Jeremy Thake's tweet stream. And so Jeremy Thake is the CTO of Hyperfish, which is a SharePoint ISV, and he's also been a Microsoft guy. And so he's big in the Office 365 space as well. And he had a couple of these points that he shared that I thought were good to spread around. There are some shortcomings. This is Teams version 1.0, of course, and so so it will get better over time. And this being Office 365, where Microsoft is releasing updates every single day, it will get better rapidly, and we'll see it's a much more mature product, let's say, by this time next year. So those are the caveats. I'm not going to go through all of them, but they're there if you're interested. I do want to move along to mention briefly some SharePoint framework things. As Mark mentioned, SharePoint Framework went generally available, was released, and is now fully supported as of 2/23/17, so within the last month. As part of that, they also the associated SharePoint Framework-based web parts are now also generally available and supported. And one of the ones that I saw Microsoft chatting a lot about was the news web part, site news. And as Mark pointed out, this is not just news on your team site, but the news bubbles up to SharePoint Home. So for those of you who are not familiar with SharePoint Home, SharePoint Home is the page that you land on when you click on either the SharePoint tile or if you click on the SharePoint word in the suite bar. SharePoint Home, when we speak about it this way, is not the root site collection, the root site in your SharePoint Online environment. So this is some other page. This is the page they call SharePoint Home. It's not the slash at the end of your tenant URL. So if your tenant, so my tenant URL is mbbmvp.sharepoint.com, and so that root SharePoint site, that is not SharePoint Home. SharePoint Home is another page within your SharePoint Online environment. So don't confuse the two.
And this one's still personalized, isn't it, Mike? This still shows that it's a particular person. It's their experience. It's news relevant to them.
Right.
It's activity relevant to them.
These are news things from sites that you're involved in some way. And this whole page is personalized. So first you see news from sites that you're involved in. Then you see your sites you frequently visited, and its roll-up of activity on those sites. And you've got your following sites that you've favorited or followed in the left nav, as well as a link back to links to corporate sites that the 365 admin has provided. So yeah, so that's a very dynamic and handy page. If you've just saved something to a document library somewhere and you've got no idea where the heck did I just put that, this page can help you find that, not only because you'll see it in the list of frequent sites as a recent activity, but also you can search there and search across all the sites you have access to. It's powered by Delve. Another thing that I want to mention with the release of SharePoint Framework is that not only are the web parts that are the initial small set of web parts produced by the SharePoint product team, but also other members of the SharePoint community, including apparently a gentleman from Microsoft from Paris, Oliver CC by the GitHub handle. He's published or curated a set of 40 additional SharePoint Framework web parts. So, and he calls these the 40 Fantastics, naming being sort of a throwback to the fabulous 40 templates that we had back in the on-premise days long ago. But these, go ahead, Mark.
Go ahead. That's cool.
Yeah. There's all sorts of eye candy web parts here, and these are just on GitHub, so you can just download them and deploy them. And I'll leave it to Ralph to explain how we would do that. But there's everything from carousel web parts and different sort of ways to show images to charts and graphs and a bunch of things you can do. All sorts of eye candy, some more practical than others.
Yeah, Michael, leave that one up for a second.
Sure.
If everybody's kind of been wondering what the SharePoint framework was meant to do, you guys, it's gunning all of the cool functionality that everybody points to at WordPress and Wix, all the cool different plugins people have been building. This is Microsoft's attempt to say, hey, we're going to get all that same cool functionality, we're going to embed it in SharePoint, and nobody's going to be able to touch this.
Right. You have to remember this thing about the way that the SharePoint framework is designed and the way that all SharePoint framework web parts are supposed to work. They're all mobile responsive. That means they all are going to look good on any browser, no matter what view portal size you have. And they're going to look good not just in your browser on your desktop, but in the SharePoint app on your mobile device. So this is part of the story of having your corporate intranet in your pocket.
This is going to be cool. That's a great slide, Mike.
Thank you. So now I want to move on and talk about events. Mark talked about a number of them. There are a couple of key ones that I want to add to that. First of all, upcoming date here, not too far away at all, March 28th, very important date for anyone who's interested in going to Microsoft Ignite. Microsoft Ignite is Microsoft's premier technical education conference. This year it is September 25th to 29th, so that's in the fall, and it's going to be in Orlando, I believe. And if you went last year, you may have noticed that the bulk of the sessions, and this thing is a 5-day conference packed with sessions, many simultaneous tracks, the bulk of content was Office 365 and SharePoint in one form or another. So if you are in this group, you're almost certainly going to want to go to Ignite. And hopefully that's something you can get an employer to pay for. But if you want to go, as soon as March 20th comes around, register soon. It does book it up. It fill up fast. It does sell out. Moving on from that, April 6th, I co-run an Office 365 adoption user group. Now, Mark, you were saying something about Anchor Technologies not being about driving adoption. I will respectfully disagree with that in saying that that driving adoption of Anchor Technologies is a good thing, and we can talk about that later. But my user group, yes?
No, it's a beer topic. Yeah, I look forward to it.
Okay. The Office 365 adoption user group, our focus is on the process of driving adoption and governance and managing Office 365 as consumers of the service, as the business side owners of it. We don't have technical discussions about how to build for the SharePoint framework or technical details about IT admin or 365 admin. This is more of a business level discussion, but if your organization uses Office 365 or you serve organizations that use Office 365, please spread the word about this. We'd love to grow our membership. And our next meeting is April 6th, and we've got a gentleman from Microsoft, Nishan De Silva, talking about advanced data management. That's April 6th, moving to May 20th. May 20th, here in ChicagoLand, we have our very own next SharePoint Saturday Chicago Burbs. And so mark your calendars for that weekend, and you can also go out there and register now.
Thanks, Mike.
So, and there's finally one other thing I have, which is Microsoft uses a tool called User Voice to allow us to influence the direction of the platform. And so there's a particular problem which relates to SharePoint governance and Office 365 governance that I wanted to bring to your attention, with the idea that you could help bring this to the attention of Microsoft. And I'll explain how that works in a moment here. So the problem is that only role admins and only certain role admins, so service administrator and some of the other roles, and the global tenant admin can get to the Office 365 message center, the admin message center. And the problem with that is that if you're managing Office 365 as a service and you want to know what changes are coming, sometimes the people that need to know what changes are coming, and they're going to help you as an organization manage and adapt to those changes, some of those people are on the business side. They're not necessarily in IT. Also, even if they are in IT, you don't necessarily want to give those people the full authority that some of the role admins have. Really what we need here is the ability to grant read access to the admin's message center. And this would, if we had read access, this would let us grant certain business people access to this so they could help us plan and manage for changes coming to Office 365 and figure out how we're going to manage those changes throughout the as they roll out to the organization. So that's the problem. The solution, at least in the short term, is to vote up this feature suggestion in User Voice. So again, User Voice is this platform, this set of websites that Microsoft uses to collect feedback, product feedback. And as people vote up suggestions, the more popular suggestions get prioritized into the development cycle. An example of this, where this feedback has actually influenced Microsoft product, is that there is a SharePoint setting in every team site called the request access email address, and that email address is the email address that access requests go to. So if someone who's in the organization but not a member of a team site wants to get into the team site and get access denied, rather than just say, sorry, you can't have access to this, if access requests are turned on, then they can send a request to this email address. But there was no way to report on that address across all team sites in SharePoint Online, because the object model wasn't exposing that property. So someone created a User Voice suggestion for that. I was one of the people who voted it up and spread the word about that, and then so sometime last year, Microsoft included that change in one of their updates, and now the object model, the client-side object model, and the REST APIs expose that property of a site. So using User Voice to influence the direction of the product does work. So what I ask all of you is to follow this link or scan the QR code, and it will take you to this User Voice page, and please vote up this suggestion. So this is read writes only in Message Center, the ability to grant read access to people in the organization to the admin Message Center. If you would please go and vote that up.
That's great, Mike. If you'll share that URL with me, I'll make sure that we promote it across to all of the members in this group. We've got about 216 now, and the Meetup website will let me actually share that so nobody has to memorize it.
So it's bit.ly/just read access to Message Center.
Okay.
And there you go in chat. Yeah, so if you can share that far and wide and get people to vote for it, Microsoft does respond to that. And as you're when you go to User Voice website, look around, read the other suggestions. If you say other suggestions that are meritorious, vote them up. And if you see things that aren't there, or rather, if you see that there's something missing, something from your experience working with SharePoint and Office 365 that needs to be done, suggest it. Now, there's a number of separate user voice forums. There's like a separate one for some of the different Office applications and a different one for SharePoint. So make sure you're the right forum. But if you want to suggest something and you don't see it out there, put it out there and then get other people to vote for it. And feel free to call us, this community, to action. And with that, I'll say thank you very much. And that concludes my news announcements.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
I see a quick time check. We're at 12:36. We got 2 more presentations to go. I'm going to take over the screen again and start the first presentation on the SharePoint framework. Can you guys confirm that you can see the next slide deck called the SharePoint framework?
Yes, it looks great.
Oh, okay. Do you actually see the PowerPoint version of it or the display version of it?
We can see you're in PowerPoint.
You can see it in PowerPoint? Okay. All right, what I'm going to be trying to do is tell you everything you need to know about the SharePoint framework in 5 minutes so that I leave the rest of the time to Ralph. You guys know me. I try to cram 5 into 10 minutes. But it's supposed to be a segue into Ralph actually showing you some real stuff. The semantic map of the SharePoint framework looks something like this. It's filled with dev languages, dev jargon, patterns and practices, lots and lots of dev coding tools, all surrounding this concept, this thing called the SharePoint framework. I'll leave you to look at these slides later when you come and download them, but you're going to see Ralph starting to talk about terms that we've never heard before in the world of SharePoint. The SharePoint Workbench, Visual Studio Code, Gulp, Bower, Backbone, React, Node.js, Yeoman, AngularJS, but it's all stuff that the developers that are members in this community, in this group, you've all heard this, and you've heard it from everybody else except you. But this is the year we actually get to start doing this stuff for real, not playing at it with injected script and things like this, but really doing it for real. And whenever we have these 5-minute sessions, I try to cover the who, what, why, where, when, and what. So that's 5 or 6. The 5 W's and the H to talk about a particular concept. The concept today is the SharePoint framework, and that starts by asking the question, what is a software framework? It's a generalized, reusable software development environment typically comprised of support programs, compilers, libraries, tool sets, application programming interfaces, APIs, and an overall generalized structure or scaffolding for a software solution that brings all these components together to enable the development of a consistent software solution over and over and over again. 2 important details are the scaffolding gets extended, not changed. So you don't change the way that it works. You extend it and use the pieces that are a part of it over and over and over again. And ultimately, the other difference is that a framework, what differentiates a framework from a library, is that the framework itself controls the overall program flow, how it actually works. It's not just structure, it's also the functionality. If we were to try to look at that diagrammatically, what a software framework is, it starts off with some kind of an editor or an integrated development environment. And what you're seeing is 1, 2, 3, 4 different kinds of editing tools. One is Atom, the other is WebStorm, the third one is Visual Studio itself, and then Visual Studio Code running inside an Apple browser, or inside an Apple laptop is what you're actually looking at. The first thing you're going to notice is you can't tell the difference between those editors. They're all starting to merge into being a common platform, and they're speaking a common language called JavaScript in this case. The rest of the software framework is actually this thing called scaffolding. And if you were to try to zoom in, you'd see what scaffolding really represents is a way of structuring your program into content, into crawlers, into models, into scripts, or into the source files versus the test files. So long as there's some kind of a pattern to the structure of the program that anybody else that looks at it starts to understand and say, hey, that's how I learned to build it too, now you're speaking a common language. Once you start building the application, you're going to be tapping into APIs, you're going to be tapping into libraries, bringing that into your code. Once you've brought it into your code, you're going to start using various kinds of tools, in this case one called Yeoman, that you've heard everywhere but in Microsoft land. Now you get to start hearing it, and you're going to hear another product called Gulp. These tools oftentimes are embedded right into Visual Studio, the one that we're used to using. But in Visual Studio Code, these are command line driven tools that are used to make the whole experience, speaking candidly, a little bit more like the way everybody else is developing. Once you've developed your different solutions, in this case, let's say it's a web part, the next part of a framework is to be able to create some kind of an emulator for moving that framework and actually being able to test it without actually having to have your very own environment. And lastly, when you get your solution finally ready to go, there's some kind of a push into production. And your tools that are a part of this framework allow you to push that solution, in this case it's a web part, up into production. So a framework is all of those different pieces. It starts and is at the core, it's the editor and the compilers that are built into either that editor or that IDE. But you're also establishing a set of standards or best practices in the way of scaffolds, in the way of the libraries and the APIs that you use and how you use them. It's the additional tools and plugins that go into that IDE that give it enhanced functionality to make your life easier. It's the emulators that allow you to test without having to own extremely expensive pieces of software like entire SharePoint environments. And then lastly, it's the ability to push that solution up into a production environment. What is the SharePoint framework then? It's a new open source set of tools, workflow scaffolding for building certain types of SharePoint targeted solutions, not all of them. What is the SharePoint framework used for? For enhancing and creating the functionality in SharePoint. Typically web pages, websites, what are called add-ins, and or SharePoint apps, and then web parts. Emphasis these days, in the foreseeable future, it's going to be on web parts. That's where Microsoft's really aiming. What does the SharePoint framework require? Office 365 and a laptop. And it doesn't even matter what kind of laptop. It could be an Android, it could be iOS, it could be a MacBook, it could be Windows. That's the cool part about it. And when you start working, you're going to be able to have a conversation with somebody else that has a completely different laptop and a completely different OS, and you're going to be able to talk meaningfully to each other. That's probably the most important distinction. What does the SharePoint framework work with? Windows OS, Mac OS, Linux OS, really. What does it not work with? I actually haven't found anything in all the time that I put into preparing for this. You're going to see a slide that looks like this. What does the new SharePoint framework tool chain look like? It's made up of all of the different components that I just mentioned a moment ago. What should I expect for the real differences? A new SharePoint page model. There's this concept called a canvas that's replacing the concept of a web part zone. That means that in the grand scheme of things, you're getting access to a page that has already some pre-built Chrome and functionality, and all you have to do is work on the functionality that's going to go and sit in the middle of that page, in the page body, on the canvas. That's where we're going to be focusing. And everything else you get for free. You don't have to develop it from scratch. Who built the framework? It's the Microsoft mechanics. Who's it for? General developers. Microsoft trying to actually hit a point where in the technology lifecycle for SharePoint, the original innovators really ran out of novel ideas. That's an honest-to-God truth. And now it's time to let SharePoint be released into open source to see what all of those creative minds can do to try to come up with other ideas, other things that can be done inside SharePoint as a platform. Why was it created? It was finally time for Microsoft to break free of all the constraints currently imposed by the current paradigm, including .NET itself. You're opening up the doors to be able to work in different languages on different platforms, knowing that SharePoint is simply the destination for everything, but there's no other constraints that you face in this paradigm. Let me skip a couple of these slides and we'll take a look at I want to leave time for Ralph. Where did SharePoint actually came from? Just to take a quick step back, this all started in 2001 with ASP. In 2003, we had ASP.NET. In 2007, more ASP.NET, and it continued to progress down that path, but it became a constraint instead of an enabler. We started seeing, even since about 2010, that there are other web technologies that were starting to come up with genuine innovations that we were not able to take advantage of. But in 2016, Microsoft started setting the stage for this embracing of open source. They started improving on custom presentation, UI extensions, data access, eventing using Node.js. They're stepping in that direction. Where is SharePoint actually headed to next? Here it is, 2017, everybody. A consistent platform. It's enterprise grade up in the cloud. It's got a modern tool chain made up of tools that can be used on any platform. It's focused on the users, and the expectation is that when you release this out into the wild, there's going to be an explosion in the next couple of months. we're going to start seeing all the cool stuff that used to be in all of the other non-Microsoft websites are going to start showing up inside SharePoint, just like that great slide that Michael gave us that showed all of the different fantastic 40s that have been developed already using the SharePoint framework. How does it actually work? It treats everything like a client-side web part, which means it's a JavaScript web application project and everything that implies. And now we get to use all of the established best practices that have been used outside of Microsoft to do that kind of client-side, that kind of JavaScript relevant tooling and scaffolding to create those applications. How does this affect my current world? It's all starting by coexisting with the current dev models. It's meant to supplement the existing practices, not necessarily replace them. It's expected that it gradually will replace things. It only makes sense to do so, but it's not a requirement at this time. Where do I find the Microsoft framework? Here, the SharePoint framework. Here's the URL that gets you started on it. Where do I go to learn more? Here's another start here. And then lastly, we've got an appendix that I want you guys to check out. If you hit these 12 links or these 15 links that are on here and spend time in them in the next week, you're going to have everything that you need to be able to do something. Handing over to Ralph. I hope I've given you enough time. You've got about 15 minutes, Ralph. Everybody, Ralph Rivas from Magenic is going to give us the next stage for the SharePoint framework.
Oh, man. All right. Let me see. Show my screen. Show my screen. Yes.
Starting to come up.
All right.
Ralph, it's just a member. It's just a user group. We're all friends here.
All right, we're all buddies. So we see a picture over here. As they say, I know where you live, and this is where I live now. So that's just a picture, real quick. So I don't have any slides. Oh, shock upon shocks. I have no slides. And I feel like the headliner act. Essentially, you're at the House of Blues all day from 7 o'clock at night. You're totally wasted, and then finally Sun Seals comes on at 2 in the morning, and you had to stay for that. Otherwise, what was the point? Right? So here was the point of the SharePoint framework. Let me clarify a couple of things first about the SharePoint framework. We might say, why the heck do we even need a framework? Isn't SharePoint a framework to itself? I said, well, technically speaking, yes, it was a framework. It was Microsoft's framework. We were working with whatever they had in order to do whatever they needed for that product. And in the end, I just make it very clear, as demonstrated just earlier by the timeline, this is a web-based product. Because it's a web-based product, you had to keep up with the web if you want to go forward. So Microsoft really had no choice but to move in this direction. They've been pushed there for quite a while. And I think that the thing that pushed them, if anyone remembers the good old content editor web part, we used to use that for very nefarious, sneaky stuff all the time. We used to stick in whatever there. We could change almost the entire environment if we wanted to with that crazy little content editor web part. Well, there was no point, as they say, if you can't beat them, join them sort of thing. Microsoft got the message. The whole PNP, what's called Patterns and Practices move, which is in part of all those links, is all part of that. So they've been going down this road for a while. But they essentially had to go down a way that didn't make them look bad, number one. And most importantly, they wanted to go down a way that they themselves can consume. So here's my first point, everybody. What we're doing in the SharePoint framework, what everyone else will be doing from this point on, is what Microsoft will be doing. Remember before when Microsoft added something new, they could do whatever they want. It was their product. They would just simply give you a patch for SharePoint, an update to SharePoint, a feature pack, whatever it was, right? And that would be so disruptive. Sometimes it's like IS reset. You got to deploy it. Everyone was afraid to deploy it because it's going to break something and everything else. Well, here's the thing. They got to do it exactly the same thing. So if there's an add-in, they write it in exactly the same way we would write it. Okay, and that means that since they're using they're eating the same dog food, whatever it is to make that dog food taste better, they're going to do. And if they do it for themselves, it will be, guess what, automatically shared with us. So when they start adding the spices, the Worcestershire sauce, and everything else that makes it taste great, tastes great, less filling, whatever it does, at least Microsoft, when they do it, will apply to us immediately. One last point. Hey, Ralph. Yes, go ahead.
That's why they actually built the new library experience and the new publishing page experience have been done. They were created in the SharePoint framework, right?
Oh, yeah. So a lot of those new web parts and everything else, that's why they released it all around the same time. And that's why Olivier and everyone else was able to come up with a whole bunch of stuff. They've been at this for a while. So this is GA now, as they say. We're all gaga for it, but it's been cooking for quite some time. So it's not it's not like it appeared overnight. This has been out there. And people have been using sort of it in in ways before it was a framework. thanks to your good old content editor web part. But now it's formal. All right. And here's
Yeah.
one last thing. As far as like the use, for example, for people that are saying like, well, hey, how is it going to work with what we're doing right now? It's just going to work side by side and everything else. Well, I do have one bit of thing to sort of like beer talk about that one, and that is that change is, I will tell you, very disruptive if you're in a pure .NET house where you're using Visual Studio and everything else. Because guess what? I'm going to show you how to go from 0 to 60 with this one. And if I touch Visual Studio at all, it'll only be Visual Studio Code at best. And that's only to show you because I could have used Notepad for this. All right? So,
Cool.
and this is the point. That's disruptive. If you're used to .NET, you're used to writing C# and all that stuff, and someone told you to now do the so-called tool chain, and here's that tool chain here in a smaller slide from thanks to Andrew Connell. The tool chain is there's Microsoft.NET. Now we're using Node. Oh, geez. We were using NuGet over here. Now we're using essentially the command line version of that, npm. Instead of Visual Studio, we're using code or Notepad, whatever. We're using something called Yeoman, and Yeoman is what's called a scaffolding thing. Scaffolding is a term that the web folks have been using for a while, but for us, we used to know that as templates. So, oh, I want a new project.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to create a new project, a VB project that's on the web. And then all these cool pages were all set up for us, and all we had to do was eliminate what we didn't want and just do whatever we want. Well, that's exactly what scaffolding is. Very easy, right? Oh, and so C# becomes TypeScript. And by the way, I'm going to give you a quick advanced knowledge. As much as we gave you a lot of links over here, there's only two things you really need to know the most of what to do. TypeScript, you got to learn that. Unfortunately, that's the one you really, really have to learn. And what's called NPM, all the command lines for NPM. That does pretty much the works. Everything else, guess what? You barely have to know them. You want to know Gulp if you're going to be like, you're going to write tests that are really, really complicated and do fancy, fancy stuff. You're a DevOps person and you really want to go to town. You can get to know Gulp if you want. But believe it or not, everything else, once you use it once, you'll be lucky if you remember it, how it works. But that's it, all right? So I'm just giving you that tip as we go forward. All right, going forward real quick. So if we have Node, that means you have to install Node. So I'm not going to cover that over here, but installing Node is basically going to nodejs.org, go and download it, follow the directions, and you're done, which gives you a program called NPM. So NPM, and I'll show you what that is right away. There's NPM right over here. NPM allows us now to essentially install anything we want. So if we wanted to install, say, for example, Yeoman, right? So we would say npm, there we go, install -g means global, and I'll say yo. Guess what? Because there's a lot of famous programs out there, including Microsoft stuff, that are going to have their own shortcut. So I just say install yo, and it'll install Yeoman for me. All right, so let's just say Yeoman's installed, which it happens to be already over here. I won't bore you with that install going through. At this point, I can create my own dev directory. I'm ready to go. I'm actually fine. So now the next thing to do is to install the Microsoft generators. Microsoft has chosen Yeoman as their generator tool of choice. That's an important thing. You can't go to another tool, scaffolding tool, and just get that and just expect it to work, because it's not. All right? Microsoft has only done, at this point, Yeoman stuff. Now, guess what? It's an open source community, which means someone might in the future do one with one of the other scaffolding. So don't let that stop you. Let's proceed over here. So basically, we would say npm, I would say install, and I want, and guess what? This is the syntax. This is why you must know npm. So I would say Microsoft, because at Microsoft, guess what? That's another alias that they've essentially come to control thanks to their participation in the community. So I will say generator-SharePoint, right? And then I'll say -g to install everywhere. And what that'll do is that'll install my generator, the Yeoman generator, for all SharePoint stuff. Again, I've done that already, so we're not going to do it. Now, at this point, I can now create a program. So I can just go yo and actually type in, for example, I know I want what generator I want. I want the @Microsoft/SharePoint generator, all right? And if I don't have it, guess what? It'll go and install it and download it and everything else. Or guess what? Look how easy this is. I just type in yo. All right, let's see.
Short for Yeoman, right?
Short for Yeoman. Oh, okay, check it out. I get to pick my generator. And look, I can do up arrows and stuff. Look, I can get here, update my generators, install a generator, find some help, get me out of here. Okay, they're open source, so they're being funny. All right, here we go. I just chose Microsoft. So look at that. You can also be running. Look, it tells me what to do. All right, what is your solution name? What is your favorite color? Okay, my solution name is, I'm going to call it Look at Me. All right, there we go. That's my solution name. Now, do I want to use the current folder where I'm at, or do I want to create a subfolder? I want to create a subfolder because why would I do that? All right, here we go. All right, hey, I get to choose a framework. No framework at all. React to Knockout. Here's a very important thing. Remember all those other terms? You heard Angular and everything else? Well, as of today, the only ones that Microsoft has been able to put up so far because of a lot of issues, and I'll tell you, Angular 2 currently has a lot of issues. So I would be very scared to do any one of those right this minute. Andrew Connell himself is pulling his hair out for that. So if he's got less hair than me, I will say, let's wait for Andrew to figure it out. Meanwhile, React and Knockout are the two right over here, right? So I can choose React or Knockout. And Knockout, believe it or not, has been brought back to life thanks to this. All right? And, of course, partly because Microsoft dealt with it. So I'm just going to choose, say, I'm just going to choose Knockout for now, just so we can choose something. What is your web part name? I'll just call it Look at Me Hello. Okay. All right. All right. And then what is your description? Look here, I said. Okay, fine. Boom, and watch it go. All right. It's going to start cooking.
And what are we seeing, Ralph? What are we seeing? We're really, for people that have been using Visual Studio their entire careers, you're looking at the equivalent of a template being generated, but it's happening from a command line using open source technology. And that might seem like a step backwards for anybody that paid hundreds and hundreds of dollars for Visual Studio, but please see it as a step forward, that this is the way the rest of the people are going to be developing for SharePoint. So we want to embrace this, we want to understand this, how they're doing it, so that we can converse with them on like terms instead of them saying, well, here's how we do it in open source, and you say, well, here's how we've been doing it in Visual Studio. We need to reach that point where we can talk to each other.
Right. Well, let me explain another reason why this is good. Okay, now imagine, here's your template. Microsoft gave it to you, and you put it in. You've been doing it for years. You didn't realize that for years they've been changing it themselves. You probably haven't been clicking on that update for Visual Studio to get the latest version of that. Well, when you're doing it this way, you're always getting the latest version with all the stuff that works. And look at this, NPM warnings, little warnings like deprecation, things that are no longer good in the scaffold. It'll tell you right away because guess what? It's got smarts in it to say, hey, there's some stuff that are not so cool in here. You may want to consider this as we're going along. And it's simply showing you as you're going along. So you are getting literally the benefit. Now imagine if every time you opened a template with Microsoft, it had to go check for itself and had to go through all this. That would actually look worse than this. All right? Oh, but guess what? Hey, I already pre-cooked this, so I'm just going to go and open up another command line. Yes. And let's go back there to dev. All right. Let's go over there. And as you can see, I already created directories.
This was a pre-built web part application that you built, or a web part project.
Not sort of. Yes. I didn't do pre-built. Okay. All I did was look. I did. There's a look at me being done. All right. So I look. There's a React version, and there's actually a knockout version already done, and I did a non-JavaScript version. I've already done those. So let me go to those directories real quick. And we can open up from right over here so you can see them. Let's go quickly. Don't mind the desktop for a moment. Go to dev so we can just see. Firstly, I just want to let you look at what the file system looks like. All right, there we go. And of course, there's our Git, our stuff from Git. Basically, it like gives you some Git stuff. So right off the bat, you have your source control pieces ready to go. So I can set this up. I have my gulp stuff over here. That's my instructions on how to build and everything else. And I'll show you that in just a moment. And then of course, here's my source. Right, and let's look at these codes. Check it out. There we go. The .ts tells me that those are TypeScript type files. All right. So if I have an editor, like say Visual Studio Code.
And hey, Ralph, pause for a second.
Go ahead.
Go back to that view of the source code really quick.
Sure.
Sometimes there's just a point there's a great point here that you're bringing up. Even you were clicking on a file called SRC, a folder, and acting like it was commonplace. But in the world of templates, in the world of Visual Studio, you don't always build stuff that follows this pattern. You're seeing a set of folders being generated that are following now an established pattern, a scaffolding for how that project should actually be organized. And that allows you to make better code as a developer because now you know you're adhering to a standard. Back over to you, Ralph.
Right. Okay. So that's, again, your starting point. Again, you don't have to even do it this way as long as you follow essentially some of the general pieces. The idea, again, is someone has already figured a lot of this stuff out. You have your starting point, and you have a way of communicating now with each other. If we go back to Visual Studio Code, we can just open it up. right? All we're doing is just file and with Visual Studio Code, file, open a folder. We open a folder and literally we get this, right? So we can go straight to the web parts. We can go and we can edit everything. Guess what? It's code. It's code,
and that's,
just like anything else.
And that's the new freeware, the new open source editor called Visual Studio Code, right?
Right, exactly. So again, we could have used any of those other systems. I could have used Notepad right now to do this because guess what? Here's how to run it. All right, so let me go down to say, let me go to the React version. React to this, all right? All right, so now if I want to run it, guess what? I just type in gulp serve, which means give me server version of this. Check it out. Kapoof. Nothing up my sleeve. No Visual Studio.
At no time did your hands leave your wrist.
Yes, no time. It's like just over here. It's like put on some music. It's thinking about it. It's thinking about it. Probably my system is slow because guess what? I got lots of stuff running. I got several desktops. Check it out. Now it's doing all these tasks. Now, Gulp, if you think about Gulp, it replaces MS Build, all right? But unlike MS Build, which does things with config files, Gulp actually does things in code, right? So you're actually writing code for these tasks. I didn't, by the way, run the cert thing over here. There's a step that I'm missing over here, which is to run the cert. All right, so
okay.
I'm just going to say, just go ahead. I don't care about the cert. But check it out. Poof.
Understood.
Look at that. And, I got my modern-looking SharePoint page ready to go, and there's my web part.
Ralph, tell them what the workbench is really quick.
This is the workbench.
That's a key point.
All right, this is the concept. This is your workbench. Essentially, this is an emulator of a sense. The workbench.html, all it is basically gives you essentially the container, all right, for you to put your web part. So whatever you do on here is going to work everywhere. So let me stop for a moment to explain why SharePoint framework. Why did they create a framework? Why did they have to go web? Okay, you guys remember now, SharePoint in the past. First, we used to have server-side stuff. All right, we had to do server-side stuff because we had to manipulate code on the back end in order for it to happen. What did that do? That actually deployed our code, our stuff, whatever .NET stuff we did, into the hive of SharePoint, which means, of course, you're touching the hive, you're touching web config, the IIS reset, but you have stuff that was built in. So you had to uninstall, reinstall. That was essentially a major thing. Those were called full trust components because you could touch anything in SharePoint. You were at the farm level. You have control. Okay. Then the next thing they gave you was the concept of the sandbox. The sandbox was like, well, this is just a baby play area. You're just testing your stuff. You only want to like touch the front end. We don't want to give you any trust to hardly anything at all. You can do a few things. All right. So we have our sandbox. We can do that. And then after that, they said, well, you know, that doesn't work for us, and that doesn't work for us. So we have a new concept called the app. Remember the provider-hosted app? You guys might remember that. Provider-hosted app.
Yeah.
Essentially, was you did your own thing. You're on your own website. However, there's a trust that says you could run inside of SharePoint. However, you're going to run inside an iframe. Very important concept. The iframe. What you're looking at over here is not an iframe, but with a provider-hosted app. In that iframe, you could do what you want. You would talk to SharePoint via REST, however you wanted to talk to it. You were still in code, or you in whatever code you wanted running off this other server. However, you were not in context. So if I wanted to do something that touched anywhere outside of SharePoint, I had to somehow communicate to it, which was impossible or not even available. Think about an iframe trying to talk to its parent. All right? Just think of all the restrictions that had to go along with that. So that was just a bad issue. So they went. Guess what? They went back to sandboxes for a while, and then they had JavaScript injection, where they're sticking stuff with JavaScript into the content editor web parts, or even just straight up into the client-side object model to like stick into like a page being rendered to touch places. This was crazy. So what they did now with the SharePoint framework is now it's in context. It's in there. That web part in there talks to SharePoint as if it was part of the page. Well, actually, not as if. It is. It's there. It's part of the page. I can talk to anything. I can make it look like anything. And because it's part of it, remember what you couldn't do, especially with a provider-hosted app, is you couldn't make it responsive. What some people tried to do was they tried to like, oh, I want that SharePoint Excel-looking piece, all right, but I don't want it to look like SharePoint, so I'm just going to go and bring that in with my iframe and everything else. Well, guess what? The moment you try to put it into a pad or a frame or anything else, poof, all your work is done. It's gone. No response, nothing else you can do. This is purely responsive. So watch. Look at that. Baby,
that
it all
so
happens.
Cool.
And right, and what did I do to this? Hardly anything at all. Right? So let me close it. All right, and it's running right now. So if I'm done, I just get Control C, and I'm out of here. Hold on a second. But first.
And what he's killing everybody is he's killing that SharePoint emulator, that thing that looks and behaves and fools the web part into thinking it's been put into SharePoint, but it's not really SharePoint. It's a fake SharePoint, a harness, if you will.
Yes.
Hey, Ralph, I know we're already 5 minutes over.
Okay.
This has been a fantastic presentation. This is just the start, everybody, of where we're going to take this. The next session in April is going to move from here into the next stuff. I'm already thinking Ralph's going to be talking about TypeScript and the Node project package manager, NPM. We got to be looking at some of the fantastic 40 that Michael named, and then we're still going to try to bring it back around into SharePoint and into some of the other topics that we've been working on. In fact, if there's enough interest, you'll see me put a poll out on the Meetup site. I'll be asking if people want to see kind of a developer track in the next session where we're actually all standing up the SharePoint framework and Visual Studio Code so we get to pretend like we're open source developers, or if there's another area that we want to go. Can you hand the screen back to me really quick?
Go ahead.
And by the way, Ralph, thanks for a fantastic presentation.
Oop, it's been done.
Okay. All right, we don't have time for the BYOP, no problem, but next session, April 12th. Can everybody see my shared screen again? Anybody?
Yes.
EDP. Okay, fantastic. Next session, regular agenda plus more member presenting. This group is finally starting to turn into members presenting. I love this. We got 20 people that attended today. I want to hear from you. I want to know what you're working on in the SharePoint framework. Next month is going to be more on the SharePoint framework. Bring your laptops to the session. We're installing everything. We're building a hello web part. We got to get everybody thinking, actually hands-on doing it. So Ralph, you may be walking everybody through this one more time, or we go look at some of those fantastic 40s and see what would happen if we brought in a 3D carousel into our own SharePoint environment. That is going to be way cool. Thanks everybody for staying a little bit longer. Thank you to Michael Blumenthal. Thank you to Ralph Rivas for your fantastic presentations today. Thanks to the tech team for pulling things off with 30 seconds left to go. You saved my laptop and brought the presentation working today. So thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Amro. Thanks, Edie, for all of the help. And we're looking forward to seeing you guys in April.
All righty.
Thank you
Thanks,
all.
everybody. Bye.
Bye.